The envelope was sitting on my father's desk when I walked in. Plain white. No name on the outside. My stepmother was standing by the window with her back to me, and when I picked it up, she turned around and said very quietly, "That isn't for you." I set it back down. I didn't say anything, but I memorized exactly where it was sitting, and I came back for it 3 days later. Welcome back to BetrayalLedger, where family secrets never stay buried for long. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and join the family, because this story is one of the wildest ones we've ever told. Let's get into it. My name is Claire Ashford. I am 32 years old. And the week my father died, the woman he had been married to for 16 years moved $4 million out of an account that was never supposed to be hers. My father's name was Thomas Ashford. He was 68, a retired civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, the kind of man who kept his tools in labeled drawers and his receipts in dated folders and never once in his life paid a bill late. He had built things for a living: bridges, overpasses, drainage systems for counties that needed them. And he brought that same structural precision to everything else. His finances, his schedule, his silences. Thomas Ashford did not do anything accidentally. He married Sandra Pruitt when I was 16. I was old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to still wish it wasn't. My mother had been gone 4 years by then, a car accident on a wet November highway when I was 12. And my father had spent those 4 years becoming quieter and more precise in equal measure, as if grief had stripped away everything approximate and left only the load-bearing parts. Sandra was different from him in almost every way. She was warm where he was measured, talkative where he was still. She laughed at things he didn't find funny and found comfort in things he considered unnecessary. Scented candles, throw pillows, the kind of decorative objects that served no structural purpose. But she made him less alone. I could see that. And at 16, with my own grief still raw at the edges, I decided that was enough. I need you to understand that Sandra was not unkind to me. Not obviously. She remembered my birthday. She asked about my job. She sent cards at Christmas with her own handwriting inside them, looping and generous, the opposite of my father's compressed print. We were not close, but we were civil in a way that required effort from both of us and acknowledged that effort without discussing it. For 16 years, that was what we were. My father's diagnosis came 18 months before he died. Pancreatic cancer caught late, the way it usually is, because it announces itself quietly, and by the time you hear it, clearly it has already made its decisions. He did 1 round of treatment and then he stopped. He sat me down at his kitchen table in the house on Birchwood Drive and explained his reasoning. The way he explained everything. Methodically, without drama. The treatment would buy him months, possibly. The quality of those months was not acceptable to him. He would rather have less time and more of himself. I respected that. It was the most Thomas Ashford decision he had ever made. What he did with the remaining time was also very Thomas Ashford. He organized. He updated documents. He met with his attorney, a careful woman named Margaret Holloway, who had handled his affairs for 20 years. He met with his financial advisor. He went through the house on Birchwood Drive room by room and decided what went where. He was not morbid about it. He was architectural. He was building something that would hold after he was gone. 6 months before he died, he called me into his study. It was a Sunday afternoon in February, cold outside, the kind of Pacific Northwest gray that sits on everything like a wool blanket. He was thinner by then, the weight loss visible in his face, his collar sitting looser than it used to. But his eyes were the same, clear and direct and slightly impatient with anything that wasted time. He said, "I want you to know that the investment account is yours." I asked him what he meant. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. He opened it and turned it toward me. Inside was a document I didn't fully understand at first glance. A trust instrument, dense with legal language, but my name was on the first page and again on the third, and the account number matched the one I recognized from the statements he had shown me once, years ago, when he was explaining how compound interest worked using his own portfolio as the example. $4,300,000. The number was printed in a table near the bottom of the second page. "Your grandmother started it," he said. I added to it. "It was always meant for you." He closed the folder. "Margaret has the original documents. This is your copy." He slid it across the desk. "Don't lose it." I took it home. I put it in the fireproof lockbox I kept in my closet, the one with my passport and my own will and the deed to my condo. I didn't think about it again for 6 months, because thinking about it meant thinking about what came before it, and I wasn't ready for that yet. My father died on a Wednesday morning in August. Sandra called me at 6:14 a.m. Her voice was steady, controlled, the kind of steady that comes from having prepared for something long enough that the actual moment almost feels like a formality. I drove to Birchwood Drive in the early morning light, the streets still quiet, the city not yet awake, and I sat with my father in the room where he had died until the hospice. Nurse arrived, and then I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee. I didn't taste while Sandra made phone calls from the hallway. She was efficient. I noticed that. She had a list and she worked through it. And by noon she had called the funeral home and the attorney, and 3 of my father's oldest friends and her own sister in Spokane. She moved through the house with purpose, and I sat at the kitchen table and watched the morning become afternoon and thought about a bridge my father had designed in 1987 that was still standing over a river in eastern Oregon, carrying weight every single day. The envelope was on his desk when I went into the study that afternoon to find a photograph. I remembered being there, plain white, unsealed, no name on the outside. Sandra came in while I was holding it and told me it wasn't for me. I put it down. I didn't argue, but I came back for it 3 days later, when Sandra had driven to Spokane, to see her sister, and the house was empty and quiet and smelled like the cedar sachets my father kept in every closet. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, a transfer authorization, account number, routing number, receiving account, amount, $4,300,000. Sandra's signature at the bottom, dated 4 days before my father died. I stood in his study for a long time. The February gray was August blue now, the light coming through the blinds in clean lines across the floor. I read the document twice. I took a photograph of it with my phone. I put it back in the envelope and put the envelope back on the desk exactly where I had found it. Then I called Margaret Holloway. Margaret had the kind of voice that stays level, regardless of what you're telling her. The professional steadiness of someone who has spent 30 years hearing difficult things and understanding that her job is to think clearly when the person across from her cannot. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds exactly. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring your copy of the trust document and the photograph." What I didn't know yet was that Margaret had already been trying to reach me. Sandra had called her office the day after my father died, representing herself as the executor of the estate, requesting a meeting to discuss account transfers. Margaret had asked for documentation. Sandra had not yet provided it. The timeline, when Margaret laid it out for me the next morning across her conference table, was precise and damning in the way that only documented facts can be. The transfer authorization was dated 4 days before my father died. My father's hospice record showed that, on that date, he was on a medication regimen that his attending physician would later describe, in a signed statement, as inconsistent with the capacity required to authorize a financial transaction of that magnitude. The signature on the authorization was not submitted through the financial institution standard process. It had been sent via fax, a method the institution still accepted for legacy accounts, from a fax machine registered to the Birchwood Drive address. Sandra had done it from the house, while my father was in the next room. Margaret referred me to a forensic document examiner and a civil litigation attorney named Paul Strickland, who worked out of a glass office building downtown and had the quiet confidence of someone who had won cases like this before. Paul reviewed everything in a single sitting and then leaned back in his chair and said, "This is not complicated. It's just going to take time." It took 7 months. The forensic examiner's report was 41 pages. The signature analysis alone was 11 pages of comparison data, measurement points, probability calculations. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the transfer authorization did not match the authenticated samples of my father's signature from the same period. The deviation was not subtle. The examiner used the word inconsistent 14 times in 11 pages. Sandra's attorney tried 3 different arguments: capacity, authorization by proxy, a verbal instruction from my father that Sandra had simply been carrying out. Each argument ran into the same wall, which was the trust document Margaret had drafted 20 years ago. Updated twice, signed by my father in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary, which named me as the sole beneficiary of the investment account and contained specific language, prohibiting third-party transfers without the written consent of both the trustee and the beneficiary. My father had built that document the way he built everything, to hold weight, to not fail under pressure. The settlement was reached on a Tuesday in March, 9 months after my father died. The full amount was returned to the trust and transferred to me. In accordance with the original document, Sandra retained what she was legally entitled to under the will, which was the house on Birchwood Drive, her personal accounts, and the life insurance policy my father had maintained for her since they married. She did not get the investment account. She did not get a single dollar of the $4,300,000 that my father had spent 30 years building. Paul called me when the wire confirmed. He said, "It's done." That was all. I drove out to Birchwood Drive that evening, not to confront anyone. Sandra's car wasn't there. I parked across the street and sat for a while, looking at the house my father had chosen because the lot had good drainage and the foundation was solid and the bones, as he said, were right. The porch light was on. The garden he had never particularly cared about but maintained anyway, because he cared about things. Being maintained was slightly overgrown, now at the edges. I thought about a conversation we'd had years ago, when I was maybe 24, asking him why he kept such careful records of everything. He'd looked at me with that slight impatience he had for questions with obvious answers. "Because things should be findable," he said. "When you need them." He had made everything findable. The trust document, the attorney, the paper trail that Sandra hadn't known was already there, already documented, already waiting. My father had built things his whole life, structures that carried weight, things that held. And in the end, the most important thing he ever built was a document sitting in a fireproof box in a lawyer's office on the 3rd floor of a building in downtown Portland. With my name on the first page and again on the 3rd, it held.